today we're going to go through some quick welcome introductions. We're going to kind of anchor ourselves in the why of engaging with data as a group here, and then we're going to review some key secondary measures and post-secondary transition measures, we're going to use poll everywhere, and hopefully that works well. We'll drop that link in the chat soon here once we're getting started. So go ahead and please do share your name and organization in the chat. We'd love to know who's on the line here. And then the other thing we'd love for folks to do once you've added your name and organization in the chat is visit this poll everywhere link or text on your phone. And we're going to, like I said, use poll everywhere kind of throughout the meeting to reflect on data. And if you go to this link that's at the top, and I'll drop it in the chat in just a second here, you can immediately kind of add in this, what one word would describe how you engage with data in your current role. Continuously, storytelling, love this. And this is why we love poll everywhere, because we get these fun functions. Lots of really great ideas here around sort of how we think about data and how folks engage with it in different ways around priorities and storytelling and identities and equity, all of these different things. This is great. I'm seeing a couple comments in the chat as well. Guidance often. That's really great to see. We'll give this another sort of second to settle before advancing to the next question, which you should be able to see. This should be activated in the poll everywhere. So you should be able to advance this question. Again, please mute yourselves if you are not, while we're kind of going through these intro portions here, but go ahead. You should be able to select all of the options that are relevant to you. So if you go ahead and select which data resources you currently use the most often in your work. Okay, so a lot of folks using National Student Clearinghouse data or internal data, other sources of data. If you put other sources of data, please go ahead and indicate in the chat what some of those sources are. We'd love to know. A lot of folks using the Illinois School Report Card, as well as the post-secondary profiles, CTE data portal from ISB, MZ and Lightcast, IBHE data. Okay, great. iPads and IBHE data. Well, we're going to look at some iPads data a little bit later today. Awesome. Thanks, guys, for participating in that. BLS data, Bureau of Labor Statistics. Awesome. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through a little bit of why we want to review data together, just to sort of set that stage before we dive in. And we're going to have, like I said, two primary buckets of data that we are going to engage with today. One of those buckets is secondary data, and one of those buckets is sort of post-secondary transitions data. And we recognize that there is a world of information out there, and there's never enough time to look at all of it. And so we're going to be looking at a subset of it today. But one of the questions that I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through will certainly be what additional data might we want to look at, both in these categories as well as any other categories that kind of emerge for folks. So at EdSystems, we think, and at the Success Network generally, we think about what are some of those purposes of engaging with data, right? So we think about it in sort of a mirrors and windows approach. One, that when we look out the window using data, we are seeing what's happening with our students, with schools, with our districts, with our communities. We're able to look out and get an understanding of what's happening out in the field broadly. But also, we recognize that those data reflect actions that we as systems builders, as administrators, as leaders, all those actions that we are taking in the systems that we're building together. Those data reflect those different decision points that we make as policymakers. And so we use it also as an opportunity to think, what does this say about our practices? And what does it say about what we could try to do differently in order to better serve students in various ways? And one of those ways certainly is engaging with our equity lens, right? So thinking about what does it mean to ensure that all students, regardless of their background, regardless of their socioeconomic status or their race or ethnicity or the community that they come from, how are we empowering them best to succeed, right? And so the two kind of prompts that we like to reflect on here are often thinking about that our systems are currently producing what they're designed to produce, which is why that mirror work is really important, to think about what about our systems is not serving students or is serving students in an inequitable manner. And then thinking about the difference between equality, offering the same exact thing to all students, and equity, recognizing, or students or community members, and equity, recognizing that different people need different types of supports or access points or those kinds of things, right? So a rising tide may lift all boats, but it's not going to certainly rectify inequitable outcomes that we've seen as a result of historical structures or decisions that have been made. So we need to think about what are the right size supports and interventions that will best serve individuals across our state. And so the big idea generally is thinking about how we use data and build kind of those conditions for data use, how we take actions that can be informed by those data in order to drive those improved results, right? So this is sort of the general these are sort of the general operating principles that we think about at Ed Systems and the Success Network around why we engage with data and how it can kind of scaffold all together to result in improved outcomes for young people across our state. And I like to emphasize that data can be used, and yes, sorry, I should have said this at the front, we will be sharing all the slides. We also will be shortly, as we are about to dive into the data themselves, we'll shortly share out a PDF of the data so you can kind of pull it up on your screen and toggle back and forth between that and the poll everywhere that we'll launch as we go through. But we will share all these slides out. We'll also share the recording out for folks both here and also folks who weren't able to join us today. So the hammer and the flashlight here, the main reason why I like to have them on the screen is thinking about, a lot of folks have experiences with using data or having data used against them in a hammer type way, right? And to hammer everything's a nail. And so folks can get really caught up in, well, what are the problems that we're seeing, et cetera, as opposed to thinking, what are the opportunities that we have that these data are surfacing to improve access or improve outcomes for young people across our state? How do we use that flashlight to identify the challenges, to highlight successes, and broadly communicate about what's happening in our state, in our communities? So I like to emphasize the importance of using the flashlight first, and then maybe we need a hammer to break some stuff up or build some new stuff. But the first thing is that we need to be able to shine a light on areas of success. We need to shine a light on areas for growth, but really focusing in that way, as opposed to in a punitive manner or in a critical manner, a purely critical manner. So we're going to dive in. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second so that I can activate our poll everywhere activities here. And okay. And we're going to first go through some secondary measures. And Laura, I'm going to ask you to drop in the chat the PDF with the data, and I'm going to share my screen so folks can see the data. And we'll walk through them, and then folks can, like I said, folks will be able to kind of like look on their own screens through the data. So in the chat, you'll see a PDF of the slides that we're about to go through, and then we'll go through a series of questions in the poll everywhere. So the first piece of data that we have here is the Illinois district average of ninth grade on track. And so this is the ninth grade on track rate. We're starting it with this 2017-18 school year and going through the most recent school year, 21-22. Certainly we have that dip, which is largely attributable to COVID and the fact that this is a composite measure. But just want to share this. This is a disaggregated measure of ninth grade on track here. And then when we look at the Success Network district average, some of these averages are a little bit higher than the Illinois state average overall. but similar patterns in terms of the kind of overall trends in ninth grade on track across Success Network, Illinois Education Career Success Network leadership communities, right? So these communities who have opted into a collective impact model and have kind of collaboratives across their community to improve post-secondary access and success. And then when we take a look at early college credit enrollment rates, we've got this broken down by early college credit overall, which is the rates of enrollment for a combination of AP, dual credit. This also would include IB, which is just really low overall, which is why we don't have that as a separate line. But then we also have the enrollments by AP and dual credit. So you see sort of steady growth in early college credit enrollment starting in the 2017-18 school year. And a lot of that growth, I think, is attributable to sort of the numbers ultimately in dual credit enrollments, even though those rates are still lower compared to the AP enrollments. But something that we, can look under the hood at is these counts in dual credit enrollments. And so you see sort of starting in the 2017-18 school year, there's a big jump both in AP and dual credit enrollments, and that the count of enrollments across dual credit kind of continues to increase across time into this most recent school year. And then finally, this is another thing that we talked about in the policy committee meeting in December, or reviewed in the policy committee meeting in December. But looking at dual credit enrollment by demography, we often talk about dual credit and how it can be a real opportunity to close gaps in access to early college credit enrollment. And so looking at that year-over-year change for dual credit enrollment by demography can be really powerful. So we saw some huge changes year over year from the 2018-19 school year to the 2017-18 school year to the 2018-19 school year, across the board. There's just sort of massive increases in dual credit across the board. But we also see that for, in the change from the 1920 school year and the 2021 school year, that there were really large increases, particularly for Black and Latinx students in dual credit enrollment. So what's interesting to see is these sort of declines for those two populations, but that may be sort of relative to the very large growth in that prior year in dual credit enrollment. And then when we look at CTE enrollments, we just wanted to take a gander at the average number of students enrolled in one or more CTE, or the number of students enrolled in one or more CTE courses by district. Those district averages, the Illinois state overall number is in that blue line, or the Success Network average is that blue line at the top. So Success Network communities way outpace the state's averages in terms of CTE enrollments, which tracks given the really robust amount of college and career pathway system development happening in Success Network communities broadly, and that tied to CTE. And then when you look, this is the same. This is Success Network versus excluding Success Network districts from the average. And again, the Success Network communities are definitely, they definitely outpace non-Success Network communities, which makes sense given the overall state averages in terms of CTE enrollments. And then finally, we've got the disaggregated four-year high school graduation rate, and that, we see the pattern sort of over time. We see some of the impacts of potential impacts of COVID across the board. We've got the disaggregation by race, ethnicity, focusing on white, Black, and Latinx students. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second if I can find there it is. Too many little toggle bars, so I can pull up this amazing Tableau map that our team member Mamusi created, and we'll share out this link. Jenny, I saw you sent me a message, and I'm going to ask that you put it in the poll everywhere when we get to that. So, because I want to capture that question for everybody. But let me share my screen so we can just take a quick look at this graduation rate map, which is not included in the PDF version that you have here. So what this is a graduation rate map by district in the state. And when we give folks access to this, you'll be able to kind of toggle around. So this is by high school serving districts. The white areas are where there are null data, which could be having to do with like literally lakes being existing, but also could be due to some data related issues. The scale, I'll just note, is 50% at the sort of bottom gray bar, just because, you know, there's no one with a 0% graduation rate. There's only maybe potentially districts with sort of null values, meaning that the data are not available in the report card. These data all come from the Illinois School Report Card. So I'm just going to show you guys what oh, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry. This is what happens when Emily is in charge with technology here, apparently. Just look at the whole United States. There we are. Found Illinois. Okay. Sorry, guys. So we're looking currently at 2018 data, and this is across all demography. So what I'm going to do is just show the difference from 2018 to 2022 to start. And so we see some darkening across the board, which is promising. The other thing I want to compare is sort of success network communities, which are a subset of communities across the state. And you can see we've got some geographic diversity in terms of communities kind of all around the state. And then non-success network communities, you can toggle with that. That's where you wouldn't see the success network communities reflected in it, just because that way we can differentiate. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go back to 2018. And we'll share this map out with folks as well. And I'm going to look at some of these demography, right? And so some of these data are not visible due to smaller populations of Black students, right? But let's see what happens when we go from 2018 to 2022. So we've got some darkening around some of those communities, which means that the rates are increasing for Black students. And we can go back and we can start again with Hispanic students. So 2018 to 2022. So we see some changes over by that demography. And we can look at white students. And we'll go back to 2018. So you see some of those shifting rates. So I'm going to give folks a couple moments to just pop into that PDF we shared out. And then I'm going to launch the next polls that we can go through together. So I'm going to share my screen on that. And so when you, we'll take like 5 minutes or so for folks to kind of dive into that PDF, and we'll drop that link again in the chat just so folks can sit with it a little bit. And I'm going to drop actually that map into the chat as well, so folks can kind of toggle around with that. And then when you're ready, we're going to go ahead and have you also dive in on the poll everywhere again. So once we go through this, just to forecast, I realize I should probably forecast what questions are going to be coming up. So we're going to go through questions including what are the surprises? What challenges are being surfaced through these data? What opportunities or successes are we seeing in the data? What might we want to know more about, et cetera. So don't feel like you have to answer everything in the surprises. I realize I should have said that sooner. Sorry about that. And we'll also identify sort of what other measures, which of these measures is particularly helpful to look at, what additional measures would be helpful to look at, et cetera. And to clarify this question that's popping up, the enrollment data is students enrolled in at least one AP course or enrollment in at least one dual credit course. So it does not it is not an answer to whether or not students obtained credit at the end of it. Thanks, Gretchen, for your question in the chat. We'll definitely make sure we capture that in our follow-up conversation notes. So seeing a lot of surprises sort of around the ninth grade on-track measures, as well as the early college measures. Mamusi, I might kick to you to explain in the chat the sort of Illinois district averages versus the non-success network one. The question in the chat, just because I know you know those data better than I, since you're in the data set yourself. So I'll ask folks to sort of, as you can, move along to the second question in this section, which is sort of what challenges are surfaced by these data. Feel free to also continue answering on the surprises, but let's think about what some of those challenges are emerging, or potential challenges. Legislative challenges, interesting. Gaps across demographic groups, access to CTE. And whoever wrote missing data, know that there will be a slide for you to specifically add what kind of missing data you think we should be adding in here. A lot of comments around dual credit access. Legislative challenges, some questions. And so that next question we have is sort of, what are the strengths or opportunities that these data seem to surface? Love the reflections on sort of, we got to dig in deeper and we need to sort of build from prior success, certainly. And we'll definitely have some discussion about what that means. Highlighting that early college, that early college coursework the early college coursework access is growing. Questions about graduation requirements and how that can be aligned to support sort of incentivizing these types of activities. Expand dual credit based on the college and career pathway endorsement. Yeah, so that kind of actually is aligned to that prior comment around aligning graduation requirements, right? Because the college and career pathway endorsement in that framework really emphasizes the importance of early college, career-focused early college credit enrollments. There's a lot of work around that in the state. Dual credit or other early college credit as a cost-saving measure. Okay, thinking about what are implications for class rank or how we kind of make the value proposition to students around early college credit and CTE. The importance of connecting secondary and post-secondary data. Yeah, certainly. So the next question would that if you're sort of feeling like you've already shared your surprises, the challenges, and you can continue to add those in as you need to, but the next question we have is sort of which of these measures are particularly helpful or insightful to reflect on? And then the subsequent question will be what else should we look at? And what other questions do we have? Which I know are starting to surface, but definitely you should be able to select any and all of them. If you can't, please drop a note in the chat. Hopefully I set the settings correctly. Okay, a lot of emphasis on early college enrollment by course type and ninth grade on track. I mean, there's obviously also a significant portion of folks saying four-year graduation rates and CTE enrollments. The total early college credit enrollments seems to be less of interest or of greater use to folks. And it's not to say that we would never consider that in the future. It's just trying to right size what we want to engage with generally. And our subsequent question is, what are those additional questions that these data prompt? What other data should we look at? Jenny, I'm assuming that was you that put our Illinois compared to national averages with dual credit enrollment. Since I told you to do that, since I made sure that you knew that question was coming. Dina, to your question in the chat, you should be able to, oh, it's saying it's full. I see. Okay. Maybe we need to upgrade our poll everywhere. Sorry about that, guys. I'll have to look into it. We'll have to investigate how we can appropriately fix that moving forward. Thank you for flagging that, Dina. And sorry to those of you who get cut off, but feel free, if you're getting the full message, feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat. That's what I will also offer. If you if you are having trouble getting into the poll everywhere, please do feel free to add your responses to these questions in the chat. We are always going to be capturing those notes as well. And after we get through these questions, I'll pause for sort of a little bit of discussion before we then move on to the post-secondary transition data. So we've got a lot of kind of agreement that we want to know how we're doing compared to national averages with dual credit enrollment. students earning college credit via AP versus dual credit, teacher pipeline data implications, how many students have at least one, how many high school graduates have at least one dual credit or AP credit. And I'll just name, some of these data may be available easily and some of them may not be available easily, but these are really important questions to surface because not only will we seek answers in the data that we currently have, but we can also work with folks like ISB and ICCB and other stakeholders to think about what does it look like to answer these questions if the data are not readily available via the report card or the post-secondary profile site. Understanding where students drop out of the pipeline, student reading source, so these longitudinal data kind of questions. Impacts of interventions like tutoring, which certainly has been a strong emphasis given COVID, and there's been a lot of state investment in tutoring, as well as kind of post-secondary supports. Brian, thanks for dropping information about kind of dual credit enrollments. One thing I'll note that comes up in conversation a lot around dual credit in particular is the difference in how Illinois does dual credit compared to other states. Illinois has way more dual credit that happens at high schools with qualified teachers than other states. For example, in Texas, students are only able to take dual credit. They have to be on a college campus, which is not something that is particularly plausible for a lot of students in our state, given the geographic size of our state and our regulatory structure. So the context is certainly important. But yeah, so we are gonna pause here for a second. And I'm gonna sweep here. And before we get into the post-secondary transition measures, which we will in just a few minutes, I want to devote just a few moments to allow folks to sort of speak up on the line here. Now that we've gone through those secondary data, any reflections that are bubbling up, what's sort of sticking in your brain before we move on to the next set of measures. Everyone's just too wowed by the data. This is what happens when you engage with numbers. It's afternoon, guys. This is not, I guess it's the lunch hour. That's also the critical component here. John and I have given so many data presentations at conferences over lunch. It's a killer. So curious, there's been a lot of talk about sort of, I'm curious for our district partners who are on the line. A lot of the questions that came up is sort of around dual credit access, AP access, earning college credit, et cetera. I'm curious if folks have a sense from in your district, what kind of the typical patterns of actual earning of college credit looks like, early college credit looks like in your districts. Do you see more students actually earning early college credit through their dual credit or AP, right? Because we know that AP is exam-based, but dual credit, obviously gets conferred differently. So I'm curious if folks have a sense of in your districts or in your regions, what the sort of breakdown is of like actually earning early college credit by AP versus dual credit, because that's not something that's like readily available at the state level. I'm curious if there are some reflections at a local level on that. All right. We can move on to the post-secondary data, or John, you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, there just a couple of comments in the chat that just recognizing dual credit, at least one district is outpacing advanced placement. And Bridget, appreciate you raising the distinction between enrollments in the courses and actually earning college credit, because we know that I think particularly for many districts may only be getting like AP scores of 3 or higher for 50% or so of their students. So I think that's an important data point that would be useful going forward as well. And then I assume that means exactly what you said, earning that AP a 3 or higher.
Right. Sorry, to be more specific. Thank you for clarifying. Jan, that's a great question about what's the impact of students who have earned AP versus dual credit. I think one thing that may be challenging is that students may be earning both, right, in different courses, but it is a worthwhile question. And that's where kind of conversations around longitudinal data are important. John, I don't know if that might be a good opportunity to just kind of like flag some of the work around longitudinal data, that just so folks know what's kind of hopefully coming down the pipeline as resources here for the state.
Right. I mean, there's a work that's continuation work that's been going on for a decade to link the ISB and ICCB and VHE data across systems, and to have that data be available sort of in an integrated data set that can support addressing some of the questions like what are the college outcomes for students who have earned dual credit, and even when you look at the ICCB dual credit report, they've done some advancement rates that do show that students who have earned dual credit are showing improved post-secondary outcomes as opposed to those who do not. So there's some of that analysis that's already happening through linked data, but we're looking to do this more at scale. Yeah. And Trisha, I want to raise that as well. Like, that is such a local issue that has such an impact on what courses students take. And a lot of districts that we've worked with have been really intentional to actually have the same weighting for AP and dual credit. And so that's kind of one of those local policy issues that really can have an impact on how we think about the availability of these courses to students.
Definitely. So I'm going to have folks go ahead. I'm going to start sharing my screen again and walk us through some post-secondary transition measures. And we'll do the same thing where we'll pause, have folks spend some time in the PDF on their own. These are all still included in that PDF. And then start answering similar questions that we did with the secondary questions. But we'll start by reviewing together some of these post-secondary transition measures. So these are really kind of on that front end. These are not kind of ultimate outcomes of post-secondary data, which is something we can certainly flag for moving forward. But for the sake of time today, we're kind of on the transition point here. So first up is post-secondary enrollment within 16 months. These are data from the Illinois School Report Card. This is the average for 4-year and 2-year enrollment. Again, this is for just general post-secondary enrollment in the state. We start with school year 16-17 and then end with 19-20, or this might be 2021. So we'll clarify that moving forward. But just overall, much like across the country, sort of a downward trend, unfortunately, in post-secondary enrollment within 4 years, but that the proportion stays roughly the same across 4-year enrollments and 2-year enrollments. And we're going to look a little bit under the hood there with some IPEDS data. I don't remember who said IPEDS data earlier. It might have been Mike. If so, here you go. The Community College Research Center recently put out a blog post that I'll link in the chat in just a second here that we can also take a look at. But they basically pulled together IPEDS data and thought and did some consideration of what is happening in terms of post-secondary enrollments by sector. And then also we'll, on the next slide here in a second, we will look at sort of broken down by demography. What I have done with this visual, with the sort of Tableau opportunity that they had created in the blog post, is I narrowed it down to a window of 2010 to 2021, or 2022, just for the sake of not having 20 years of data, but rather really focusing in on the last decade. So, as you see, we've got kind of a decline overall in post-secondary enrollments, including in community college. Illinois generally outpaces other states in community college enrollments. Mike, I feel like you've got a wealth of knowledge on that front, so I welcome you adding thoughts to the chat on that. Again, when we look at these sector enrollments by demography, we've got these age groups at the top, and then we've got the race ethnicity at the bottom. So what I will note is this under 18 and I'm going to try and do the little annotate situation. Okay. That's not bad arrow considering the fact that I was freehanding it. But the reason why I want to flag that is because what that tells us is that driving our community college enrollments right now is actually, given the declines across other age groups, is enrollment in typically dual credit, right? These under 18 crew is mostly dual credit students or early college credit students rather than sort of quote unquote traditional age post-secondary students or community college students in this case, as you can see with the blue line up at the top there. Good question on the population trend. I don't have that at my fingertips, but that is certainly something we can look at moving forward. So again, community college remediation rates is another key transition measure, right? So of high school students, Illinois high school graduates enrolling in community college, what percentage of those students are needing remediation? And so what we have here is the overall rate in gray. The orange is math remediation rates, and the brown is communications, which is broadly English. And so we see declines in remediation rates, which is great. A lot of this is attributable to work on improving student readiness, right? And we're going to look at some transitional math enrollment data and offering data in just a second here. But also we know that there's a lot of work at the post-secondary level to think about dev ed models broadly and how students can more quickly get placed into credit-bearing coursework. So thinking about both addressing the skills-based needs at the high school level, but also at the post-secondary level once students are there. So just to focus in on transitional math enrollments, because that has the sort of longest timeline, because it was instituted as a requirement for districts to start implementing with the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act in 2016. We've seen massive scaling of transitional math. We're going to look in a second here. At sort of where courses are offered and remediation rates. But just to kind of flag, like, this massive scaling of transitional math enrollments, these are the counts of enrollment counts. And then again, looking at where are there approved transitional math partnerships by course type. And so for those of you who are uninitiated or underinitiated perhaps to transitional math, there are kind of a few primary pathways in transitional math, and that is to sort of right size that remediation coursework, right? Or that transitional instruction coursework at the high school level. And so saying, quantitative literacy and stats, that's sort of the more general math pathway. There's also a STEM pathway that districts can develop and implement. There's also a technical math pathway. And there's a combination of folks can offer multiple types of courses. And so the visual on the left here is showing us where there are approved courses or courses that have been submitted but haven't been quite approved yet. The purple is where districts have chosen to opt out entirely from transitional math specifically. And then on the right-hand side, we've got sort of the remediation rates by the math remediation rates, just to kind of line up sort of the need for remediation and where sort of this early intervention is happening through transitional math. And then I think this is the final transitional math data that we're going to look at, but we looked at this also in the committee meeting in December, but looking at as a percentage of all transitional math enrollments by kind of these core demographic groups, Black, white, and Latinx students. So you see some variation there. These data, I'll just acknowledge, are not complete data, right? We do not have remediation rates in a disaggregated way, right? So we do not know that as a percentage of students who, for example, as a percentage of students who need remediation at the community college level, what percentage of those are Black students, what percentage of those are white students, what percentage of those are Latinx students, which would be obviously a very valuable data set. But currently our remediation data are not publicly available in a disaggregated way. So I will acknowledge that limitation there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to let folks spend some time in that PDF, and I am going to work on activating our questions here. It's going to be the same questions as last time, right? So we're going to have surprises, what challenges are surfacing, what strengths or opportunities do these seem to suggest, which measures were most helpful, what additional questions are kind of prompted by it. So take a minute to look at those data, engage with them, reflect on them, and then start getting into the, and I'll pull up the poll everywhere slides in just a moment here, but I'll give folks a minute to engage with those data before we dive in. So we'll take about 5 minutes before kind of looking at that. I'm going to do some scrolling through the chat to see what we can respond to here. Let's pause on the sort of what's surprising, knowing that down the line, we're going to talk about what challenges are surfacing, what opportunities are surfacing, what questions are bubbling up. What are the most surprising measures or most surprising things that you're seeing in those data? So a lot of comments on declines in post-secondary enrollment. That the enrollment hasn't bounced back. So surprises around the fact that community college enrollment particularly is declining, and that any growth in or stability in those numbers is coming from the under 18 set. This disaggregated data for Latinx students. So potentially thinking that the post-secondary enrollments is sort of informed by students wanting to enter certain career pathways for certain certifications. So we can go ahead and kind of advance the next slide. So what are those challenges that are bubbling up as we look at those data? What is this telling us about what challenges are happening in our system, or what barriers may be existing in our system in that post-secondary transition space? Student debt. Students might not be able to, on the path to bachelor's degree, perceive value of these degrees. Thanks, Dina, for dropping the National Student Clearinghouse data in there. Or in the chat, I should say. The need to strengthen the path into our colleges. What's the role of counselors? What barriers are happening around transitional math in implementation? Student readiness. There's comments about data around debt and tuition costs, real costs of college, et cetera. Thanks, Mike, for answering the question on kind of the average community college student age. Social mobility scores. Okay, so for whoever added the social mobility scores, would love to know sort of where you're seeing those data, and that can help us kind of identify where we might be able to explore those for Illinois. And I'll move us forward to just sort of what strengths or opportunities do these seem to surface, right? Where are there maybe opportunities to celebrate certain aspects of this transition or this transition point, the post-secondary transition point? Definitely something to celebrate that remediation rates are going down. And I'll just note that, while transitional math is something that has been scaled broadly in the state, and I think, we're seeing impacts of it, knowing that transitional English is starting to be implemented and thinking about how that's going to also hopefully impact remediation rates and communications also going down. So that's exciting. And a lot of work at the post-secondary level, again, around dev ed reform, hopefully will also impact student success. Any other students exploring and or earning, an associate's degree at the high school level, recognizing that there's a lot of success amongst success network leadership communities and how that can be expanded or learned from. Again, that's one of the kind of core purposes of this policy committee, is to think about how can what success network communities are doing be shared, talked about, in order to help support other communities to see similar successes. Career exploration, early college credit, all those kinds of things. Great. And then, similar to the last time, wanting to have a sense of which of these data, and again, sorry, we'll probably run into the cap on being able to vote on which measures are most helpful, but if you can, you should be able to select all of the measures that seem relevant to you. Remediation rates, transitional math enrollment, everything is important. Love seeing a live donut chart. This may be signaling that we've reached our cap here. But the enrollment disaggregated by sector and demography, post-secondary enrollment overall, remediation rates. And then I know this is starting to kind of come up in the chat, and it also looks like folks are already starting to weigh in and vote, but what other questions are these prompting? What other data might we want to look at? What has had the most significant impact on reducing dev ed? Gateway course data using longitudinal data, persistence of students earning early college credit, disaggregated remediation data. Couldn't agree more with whoever said that. I would upvote that myself. Hint, hint to our state data resources. Students, okay, so dev ed, sort of persistence of students needing dev ed courses, wage information across education levels, it's definitely important. There's a question about sort of the bump in transitional math enrollment. I think a big part of that, and John, Laura, etc., correct me if I'm wrong, I do think a big part of that since 2019 is just the scale and like the number of courses that have been approved. Maybe there is an impact of COVID too, but I think it's largely just sort of the implementation scaling up.
Yeah, I think the implementation has been taking root, and it's been part of the state's plan for implementation, kind of scaling among districts.
Thanks, John. Okay, so we've got some questions around like longitudinal data, right? So like what happens when students are enrolling in early college credit? What happens with students who aren't enrolling in post-secondary? How do we get disaggregated remedial data, et cetera? That's all great. Okay, so I'm gonna again stop sharing my screen. And again, thanks Michael for flagging that it capped out on responses. We'll again explore how we better leverage our Poll Everywhere resource here to ensure that we're getting as many responses as possible without restricting. Dina, feel free to jump in.
Yes, I just wanted to say for people who asked about the source of the data, and then I put it in there, and one person mentioned it takes me to a 2017 report, and that's correct. And if you read in my comments, I would just about give my right arm to have National Student Clearinghouse Research Center go back to publishing the state-by-state data tables. They don't do that anymore. And I've talked with Doug Shapiro, the director of the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. So if anybody out there has any pull with National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, you know, I know that IBHE, as well as Illinois Microcredits Transfer, which I'm the coordinator for, would love to be able to follow up on that data. We used to be able to see for years we were like #3 in the nation, and then we moved up and we got to be #1, and then they stopped publishing the state-by-state data, and they just do a national overview, which isn't super helpful because there are many states that aren't doing as well with transfer student degree completion as Illinois is. So if anyone has any pull in that, that's the kind of thing where the additional data would just be golden.
Yeah. And definitely welcome just taking a step back and thinking, okay, so we've looked at some secondary data, we've looked at some post-secondary data, and we'll launch one final poll everywhere before we go. But I want to just sort of open the floor for any sort of reflections on that post-secondary data that we haven't talked a little bit more about. I know there's been some conversation in the chat, but anything that's really particularly bubbling up for folks as we think about that post-secondary transition, and what we might want to know more about, or what we want to celebrate and build from, et cetera.
I'm happy to jump in. I think one thing some of us have been struggling with is that, you know, one would think that as remediation rates are dropping and dual credit is increasing, that would reflect itself and increases in post-secondary enrollment, and it's not. And so I just think that's a big question. We organizationally are trying to understand what's going on. We know there's a lot of factors, but what are some specific strategies we as a state can think about to get at that particularly troubling stagnation and drop in post-secondary enrollments?
Yeah, that's great.
I would just note that recently Indiana, excuse me, but I've got raisins in my mouth, I'm sorry. Recently Indiana launched an initiative in response to what Jonathan was just saying about, you know, you do remediation, you see remediation, need for remediation dropping, you see, you know, more and more students doing some sort of early college programs, and yet the enrollment, you know, is still not there. Post-secondary enrollment is still falling, and it's not just the demographic cliff, although I do think that's part of it, but Indiana took their early college program to another level. They've launched an initiative where in the next few years, they want to greatly increase. I'm trying to remember what the actual numbers were. I have it, and in a minute I can put it in the chat, but they want actual high school students to have a credential of value, is how they're putting it. Not just credit, but a credential of a post-secondary credential of value before they graduate high school. So, and they want it to be like 60% or something like that. I'll find the actual number, and there's on the Indiana Commission for Higher Education website, there's information about it, but they are really stepping up the idea that not just should they be taking, you know, coursework that reduces their requirement for remediation and, you know, dual credit courses, but they want them to actually have a post-secondary credential of value before they graduate high school. So I don't know if they think, you know, and it's sponsored a lot by, there's also, it's not necessarily like an associate's degree. It might be a credential for vocational technical. You know, it could be whatever. It could be that they finished all their college gen eds and, you know, and have that as a credential, but they're really stepping up that, the goal for that.
Thanks, Dina. Report on statewide transitional English participation. Seeing that pop up in the chat. Stuff around credentials. So more broadly, I need to get to the right window. Never a dull moment technologically, as you guys all know. I want to just sort of take a step back and think about what are some of the potential policy implications of these data that we've reviewed? And some of those ideas have started to pop up, but what are some of the things that we might want to think about from a policy standpoint, given that part of the purpose of our conversation today is sort of surface some of those core challenges and opportunities that are emerging from these data. And this can be sort of statewide, it can be local implementation. I know some of these have started to come up in the other areas, but wanted to give another opportunity to catch broader policy implications from what we've been reviewing here. Reducing barriers to enrollment in post-secondary, increasing affordability. And again, feel free, if you end up encountering any challenges with the poll everywhere, feel free to drop thoughts in the chat. Transitional math access. Considering the relationship between graduation requirements and units of study. Credentialing teachers for early college credit, particularly dual credit. Thinking about student eligibility for these courses. These are great questions and thoughts. Funding for dual credit. Again, addressing barriers to credentialing for teachers in dual credit. I'll flag that the Higher Learning Commission, which accredits post-secondary institutions, is actually considering some updated criteria for credentialing for instructors that is very interesting and potentially layers in thoughts around like relevant experience, which would open the doors for different dual credit credentialing opportunities. Connected learning, how connected to learning students feel, what the student experience of that, supporting those transitions. Expanding work-based learning credits. These are all really great ideas. Give another moment here for folks to add thoughts. And again, if you're encountering any challenges with the poll everywhere, please don't hesitate to drop ideas in the chat as well. We'll capture everything. Funding to support work-based learning. A lot around teacher credentialing for STEM and CTE. Thinking about which policies are accelerators or barriers. Scheduling and structural challenges for students to access these opportunities, really great nuances here. And then sort of the last question we have is, what other data are worth us exploring in the future? And this is another one where you can upvote. Again, if any trouble with the poll everywhere, please do not hesitate to add thoughts in the chat. Sorry about the challenges there, but you should be able to add in specific measures or types of data and folks can vote on it here. Qualitative measures, great idea. And if folks have specific sources of qualitative measures, certainly welcome those ideas in the chat. I think that's something we're really focusing on at Ed Systems, as well as sort of once we identify stories that seem to be emerging from the quantitative data, thinking about what qualitative data or follow-up with the individuals represented in those data can help us understand what's happening there, right? longitudinal outcomes for dual credit students, correlation between credentialed CTE or STEM teachers and completion of dual credit in AP. And I know folks were surfacing other data earlier on, so we will capture all of them. But anything else that hasn't come up yet, would definitely love to capture here. Credits for work-based learning, how it's connected to potentially competency-based assessments. And again, as always, if there's any trouble with the poll everywhere, please feel to drop ideas in the chat. Apprenticeships, how are apprenticeships affecting data? What's the impact of the competency-based pilots in the secondary level on post-secondary success, employment data, work-based learning data? This is all great. Really appreciate all of these thoughts. For whoever added impact of undocumented students, just would be curious if you want to add more thoughts in the chat about what impact on what. I'm curious what kind of measures that would end up meaning we should look at. Dual credit continuity. Okay, so I'll just flag a couple of things here. One, our next policy committee meeting is going to be in March, Thursday, March 23rd to be precise. So it'll be just a general committee meeting. We'll, similar to December, we'll talk about kind of any new policy areas that are emerging, some implementation related stuff. We're also going to be looking to highlight at least one leadership community, Success Network leadership community, some form of their practice that will that is worth kind of elevating and reflecting on and learning more about. So if you are a member of a leadership community and you have some really wonderful practices you want to highlight and share and toot your own horn, don't hesitate to reach out to Laura or myself. And we will also kind of talk about emerging needs for kind of working groups. There are some topics that bubbled up in our first committee meeting that we want to focus in on. And so we're formulating some ideas around how to kind of have smaller working groups that will dive in more particularly on those issues. One of those issues being kind of transportation related issues that really came out strong in our first meeting. The invitation will be forthcoming. Keep an eye out for that from Laura. The other thing that I would be remiss not to note, and Jenny, this also goes to your question about, can we ever get together in person with this group? If everyone comes to the Illinois Education and Career Success Network conference on March 8th, then we absolutely can. We will also be doing a 10-year anniversary of the network reception the night before on the 7th, but we would love to see as many of you as possible there. The agenda is on the website. The registration information is on the website. We hope to see all of you there. Please feel free to spread the word. We have so much great content coming your way. We have an amazing keynote speaker from the U.S. Department of Education. We are just so thrilled to be celebrating 10 years with all of you and many others around the state, and hope to see all of you there. And I know many of you are also going to be, several of you on the line here are actually going to be presenting. So I'm very excited to hear from you. Sarah, thanks for dropping that in the chat. That is it. Well, and now you can see what the website looks like, because I don't know how technology works apparently, and I am clicking on links. I'll just say thank you all for participating today. I know it's a lot to get into the data and reflect on it. We're going to be capturing these notes. We're going to continue to dive into data, both in the sort of full committee structure. I think in the future, some of the considerations we have will be around do we want to dive in on a specific topic and a specific set of measures on in that regard, as opposed to kind of this broad landscape scan that we did today? But just can't thank you enough for your contributions here. We will definitely be capturing the notes from the chat and from the poll everywhere and everything, and are really looking forward to continuing to engage with you all in conversations around policy and data and practice and how it all can and should fit together. So those of you who are experiencing snow like we are in Chicago, I hope you are staying warm and safe, and looking forward to continuing to chat in March at the full committee meeting.